My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org, and you may know me from such films as Brown Bears Love to Eat Salmon and Bear Denning and Hibernation. But today, I'm going to be talking about a different topic. I'm going to be talking about bald eagles, and I'm joined with John Howe and Amy Ries from the Raptor Resource Project. Thanks for joining me today. So, and I had a neighbor just visit me. I don't know if you heard the dog barking, but there. So hopefully it didn't drown out too much of my narrative.
It's 100 pounds.
Okay. Because right now across North America, bald eagles are nesting, and they're dealing with some fairly challenging springtime and late winter conditions, and they show a lot of adaptations and resiliency to survive this challenging time period. And John and Amy are with a nonprofit organization called the Raptor Resource Project. And can you tell me just a little bit more about your organization and its mission?
Yeah, so Raptor Resource Project started out captively breeding peregrine falcons for repopulation after DDT, just like the bald eagle. And then, amazingly, with the education program and outreach and the movie American Eagle, the Decor Eagle Cam came of being and went viral back in 2011. So the use of cams for education and really, getting that out, we've got an active education program for classrooms. So generating interest in helping develop the next generation of conservationists, that's probably a big part of what we're doing right now.
And today specifically, I think we want to focus on some of the birds that we can see on your cams on explore.org. There are bald eagles nesting across North America. Some of them are nesting right in snow, getting buried in snow. So they do show some pretty interesting adaptations to surviving these cold conditions. But for people who might not be familiar with bald eagles, can you give us a little bit of an overview of just their overall size? They are one of the largest raptors in North America, correct?
Yep, absolutely.
Right. And size, weight distribution, different male to female?
Male to female, yeah. The males are a little smaller.
7 to 12 pounds.
Yeah, I want to say the males are, you're going to see them like maybe 8 to 10, and the females maybe 9 to 12, so somewhere in there. There's a little bit of overlap. I'm sorry. Questions like, how big is something? I can say big. I tend to be bad on saying how many pounds it is.
The female about 30% larger.
Yeah.
And I think that ratio is the same, across the country.
Yep.
Even though the northern eagles tend to be larger than the southern eagles in the warmer climates.
Oh, and I forgot to mention that if any of the audience members out there do have questions for John and Amy, please feel free to drop those comments in the chat. We'll be happy to try to answer those later on in the program. We'll be sticking with you for about a half hour this morning or afternoon or evening, no matter where you happen to be. So raptors, these eagles are fairly large raptors. It is tough to generalize about their overall weight because there can be so much variation across North America. But they are one of the conservation success stories of the late 20th century. So right now their populations are fairly healthy. In your area, are you seeing healthy numbers of eagles?
They are, and they've been on the rebound here for a while. I think Amy probably mentioned this too, but typically around riverine systems, eagles eating fish, but
yep.
Seeing actually populations probably much more than they used to be in the rural areas, just with the farming, and there's some concentrated farming activities and things like that are adding food sources and making it possible for them to go places that they typically hadn't been as much in the past.
The original population, before they were more or less extirpated by DDT in this area, appear to be a lot more shy of humans. So if you look at historical records and people talking about eagles, they were really a little wary about us, probably because we used to do things like shoot at them. They return in a vastly changed landscape with a lot more people, with laws against harming them or even really disturbing them too much. So they become a lot more accepting of people and a lot more tolerant of living near people.
So I think that's something I've noticed with other species of wildlife too, is if we give them space and we give them protections, then they're able to sort of adapt to our presence. Not all animals, but many species thankfully have that ability, because humans are increasingly modifying the world. But one thing that eagles have to deal with, of course, that is sort of outside the influence of humans is weather. And right now, eagles are nesting in some quite challenging conditions. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the physical adaptations that eagles might have to deal with cold conditions, especially sub-freezing conditions that they might experience right now?
You want to take feathers?
Sure. So the feathers really, have to be, I think, one of the major components as far as being able to survive the cold temperatures up here in the north. Just the structure of the feathers and the type of feathers. So if you can imagine the layered effect of having all the down feathers, just like us having a down coat, right?
Yeah.
The down feathers close up to the body, and then the feathers actually having different components. Some of the feathers have down right up against the base of the quill where it's inserted into the flesh, and then it grades out to more the actual feather that you see. So the feathers, the feather actually can beat up water, and it's hydrophobic, basically, if the technical term, to stop water from coming in and reducing the insulative properties of the feathers, that light fluffy down. The eagles can control air movement with the feathers by either pulling them tight to their body and becoming more sleek, or they can rouse and kind of fluff them up and actually just expand the insulative layer that they've got of the feathers. So some neat control that they have there. The other thing with feathers, I think, too, is that the temperature gradation, if you take a look at an eagle while it's being covered with snow or just the snowflakes are coming down, the heat loss is so small coming. They're so well insulated and they can control that. But when they're in insulative mode with their feathers, there's a really neat picture that's just being put up there showing Mom Decorah in the evening during one of the snows that came in. And we see that by just the snow comes down, and for hours upon hours, even all night, none of the snow is melting. That just shows how efficient they are in keeping warm and conserving all that energy that they've got inside 100 plus degrees internally.
Yeah. I know, I used to say I wish my house was insulated that well.
Right. So, and the other really cool thing is just their blood flow to the extremities and their core. Amy can talk about that.
So they basically do countercurrent heat exchange in their legs, and then they also, if it's really cold, will shift their blood flow a lot like we do. So if you're outside and it's cold and you start to shiver, your blood flow will shift towards your core. They do that as well, so that also helps them retain more heat. And because they have more blood flow around their stomachs, it helps them to gain more calories, more nutrients out of the food that they're consuming. So that's another important part of it as well. Their legs don't get cold. They keep their leg muscles under their feathers. They countercurrent heat exchange, and they change their blood flow. So all of those things help.
Right. And the components, that their body is made of, the feathers made out of organic material, not water. So very little talons. You think about that, it's like, oh my gosh, they're getting so cold. The beak area, which is made out of the more the keratin tissue. So the lack of water there with a lot of those tissues really doesn't matter if they get close to freezing. So they don't feel that, like their fingers going numb, their talons are not getting numb. They don't have that kind of water component like we as mammals do, humans.
It is sort of amazing to think about. Humans have a little bit of those adaptations. We have a tiny bit of like counter-current exchange in our hands and our legs, but not very much. And we don't really have a lot of insulation compared to other animals. So we're essentially like still tropical critters.
Right.
That's why we keep all of these clothes around us, So
someplace warm.
We build big houses, to keep us warm. We wear a lot of clothing. But these animals out in the world don't have the same options. So thinking about feathers, thinking about their counter-current exchange, some really amazing adaptations. And those are physical adaptations, though. But eagles are also showing behavioral adaptations to cold weather.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Anybody who watches the camera knows that when that temperature drops, we were talking about this earlier, and John brought this up, those eagles disappear. We just don't see them, and that's because they're hunkered down somewhere in a microclimate, they're staying still, they're conserving their energy.
Right, and that's probably more so when they're not incubating or nesting and sitting on eggs. That when the first eggs are laid, that totally changes the behavior. They don't have a choice but be on those eggs. So that would be a major deviation and problem with them coming off the eggs. But when they seem to hunker down in that really cold weather, and with the other eagle of the pair, a lot of times they're nesting close by. But before the eggs come, we just don't see them.
Yeah.
They go and they find some spot to disappear to, and it's probably something a little bit more out of the elements, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, so they conserve energy, they hunker down, they move around as little as possible, and even in incubation, they're not moving around very much. And then if they're off territory, they'll congregate in large groups. They can follow one another around. They can steal from one another. So that makes finding food a little bit easier and exhausts a little bit less energy. And then they also gorge their food. So partially another eagle won't steal it, and they'll get it down as quickly as possible. So they get as much nutrients as possible in as short a period of time as they can.
And they got the reserves. So and they've got the crop, or snack pack, as the kids like to call it. So they've basically got that reserve that when food is available, they can take as much in as possible, gorge, whatever, and then they've got those reserves to get them through. If they have to be sitting there conserving energy, they've got the food and the resources to do that.
Yep.
So the adults seem quite tolerant of cold, but that might not necessarily be the case for young, the eggs and the hatchlings. So I'm curious to know, why would an eagle, for example, start to begin nesting at a time of the year where their eggs could potentially freeze if they're left unattended, and they could hatch, during sub-freezing weather as well?
We think it has to do with how long they're in the nest, and then how long it takes them to achieve some level of independence. So we're going to start looking at bad weather coming in maybe in September, October, maybe November. These eagles spend, it's 35, 40 days until hatch, and then 75 to 80 days in the nest, and then they have a learning period beyond that. So that eagles lay their eggs early, first of all, means that they can take advantage of kind of a seasonal flush of food when the eaglets are hatching, but beyond that, it gives the eaglets a very long time to spend in the nest, to fledge, and then to spend time honing proficiency and really learning how to hunt and how to fly versus, hey, I have wings, look, I'm flying.
Right.
So we think it's because they have really an extraordinary long life cycle for a bird.
And it's strategic. Period. We found out what at our North Nest last year with a second clutch of eggs, the devastating effects that can happen when the eggs are laid just 3-4 weeks afterwards. And the eaglets were hatching right when the black flies were coming out, and that ended up in the eaglets living for about a week before they perished. But so the other thing too is just the whole cycle of things up here with the seasons. So you see nesting activities in the south where it's warm all the time happen much earlier. Their eagles down there are getting ready to fledge right now. So that's interesting how the temperature zone in the North America, where you are in the country, and the seasonal effect of that changes when the eagles are going to lay eggs, when they're fertile, and then when their young are hatching and then fledging before dispersal.
Right. And in Florida, there's also some thought. So the Fort Myers eagles in Southwest Florida they're almost tropical, really, and they have a lot flatter light cycle than we do. Our light cycle kind of goes like this, and theirs kind of goes like this. So there's some thought that the real trigger for photoperiodism in more tropical birds is actually light intensity. And if you look at weather down in South Florida, you'll see in the summer it's the rainy season, it's cloudy, hurricanes come in, where you have the most light intensity kind of in what we would consider to be the off season. And there's some thought that that's also a driver of their behavior, which is really different than what we see in northern eagles.
That's fascinating. We see, you can't, it's hard to sometimes lump the behavior of an animal, a species, into, one category or another, because there is such a wide variation, especially in a species that's spread basically from Alaska all through Canada down to Florida and beyond. So, this is kind of related to, one of our questions, but it's also one that's come up in the queue from viewers who are wondering. So how do eagles, protect their chicks during the first few weeks of life? Why do they sit on them after they've hatched? Is that an adaptation to help them to survive cold, or behavioral adaptation?
Yeah, that's really, and this goes with the eggs too. We got a really neat picture of Mom Decora's brood patch just last week, and they actually will remove the feathers in that area. You can see in the picture that's there. You can see bare eagle flesh there, and that's her brood patch. Amy said she thinks that's the first time we've actually.
It's the first time we've seen a picture, although we don't think that they deliberately remove their feathers like a duck or a goose plucking down. It appears that hormonal changes in their body cause that molt to happen naturally, and possibly rubbing up against a surface will do that. That I'm only bringing that up because that gets, I guess I would say, debated a lot.
Yeah. So with the eggs and with the young eaglets that have just hatched, they're very vulnerable. They've got that fluffy down. That's what everybody likes to see right when they hatch, and they're so fresh and young like that. But they will come down and they will tuck them in, and you see them very carefully ball up their talons and just carefully rocking back and forth, and they're looking down and they're making sure that they're placing those in the right area, and then they'll start lowering down, and they'll I always love that when you see the eagle anchor their beak, in the nest, and then they start doing the shuffle with their feet and their talons under, and really they're positioning those eggs or the young eaglets right up against that warm brood patch area. That's really the critical factor. They're keeping them dry, they're keeping them warm, they're protecting them from the elements, and sometimes we'll see the eagles. I think it was just yesterday I saw one of the eagles. It almost was like she was keeping the area around the eggs dry by spreading her wings out, and you could see the water droplets from the sleet coming down and the rain, and they're just balling up on her. But that's stopping water from coming down into the nest in the first 6-8 inches around where that egg cup is. There's a nice picture being shown of the water beads beating up on the feather surface there.
It's also helpful to remember that an adult eagle's body temperature is around 105. They can actually manipulate it a little bit, but it's around 105. And perfect temperature for brooding eagle eggs, we think, is around 99 degrees based on work done at the American Eagle Center. And so they have heat to burn. So when they sometimes get up and leave the eggs for a little bit, that really is okay, because the eggs can get too warm. Too warm is also a danger. So they really control temperature by certainly by rolling them, by shifting them around, by getting off them, and so on and so forth. That's all very normal behavior.
Yeah. And I think, Mike,
go ahead.
You're probably leading into this, but then once they get to be about 2 weeks old, then that fluffy down starts changing into thermal down, and they get to the point where they're larger, for one thing. It's a little harder for the parents to cover them up, and they get to the point where they can be left unattended as far as being protected temperature-wise when that thermal down comes in at about 15 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely a question in our queue here. What point are the young birds able to maintain their own body temperature? So thanks for getting at that. But maybe I'll backtrack just a little bit to the eggs for a moment. It seems like the eggs have more more tolerance of cold conditions than they do for really hot conditions. If they rise above, like you mentioned, Amy, that 105 degree temperature, perhaps that's too hot for them.
Really in development, they have cold tolerance. So they'll suspend, if you think of like the eggs in your refrigerator, which probably aren't fertile, but they'll suspend real early in development very well. If you get later in development, and we've seen this and you brought this up as well, mom and dad, mom and DM2, an eagle male and female are always on those eggs, because once they hit a certain point in development, they don't suspend well.
Right. And not so much in eagles, but we see that it even more pronounced with peregrine falcons, and that is the delayed incubation. Yeah. They don't really start even full incubation until 3 eggs are laid. So there's a vulnerable time period there, probably even more of an issue with peregrine falcons than eagles, although they're typically in this region, they're laying their eggs a little bit later in the year. So it's not typically going to be a factor with that delayed incubation, but they hatch a little bit closer with the delayed incubation. But eagles will sit off those eggs for a little bit, and they see, like Amy said, they'll be they're tolerant to that while there's really not a developed embryo inside that egg.
And if you're joining the chat just a little bit late, I'm going to reintroduce everyone here. My name is Mike Fitz, a resident naturalist with explore.org, and I'm joined today with John Howe and Amy Ries from the Raptor Resource Project. They're a partner with explore.org. So you can check out the Decorah eagle cams. They have many other bird nesting cams scattered across North America. So really fascinating to get to some insight into the behavior of these animals that we might not be able to observe closely otherwise. I think we do have just a few more minutes left in our chat. So John and Amy, if you want to take a few viewer questions, I can throw those your way.
Yeah, right on.
All right.
Take a look here and see. Okay, I see them here. So let's take a look.
And I was, one of the questions that I was looking at was, could eagles from California's warm weather, or even Florida, we talked about eagles in Florida just a little bit earlier in the chat, could they survive in, sub-zero weather? It seems with people, it takes a little bit of acclimating to get used to that. But what about animals that don't have the ability to put on gloves or a hat or hunker down indoors like we can?
Yeah, well, that's a good point.
It's a really good point. My guess would be, and this is a guess, like hashtag musing, right? I suspect an eagle it could survive if the only question was its physicality. Would it know how to hunt? Would it change its reproductive timing? If you brought a nesting eagle from Florida up into Minnesota, I assume it would still be attuned to an earlier nesting chronology. So
yeah, I would think the eagle could survive, I would think, not as well, not as efficiently. It doesn't have that larger size, which we believe is an adaptation for colder weather and needing to get beyond those time periods where there's a storm and food isn't as available and they need to get through that period. So I would think that just surviving would be possible as long as the weather is not really bad and it's like, oh, there's water and there's fish in there. If it's by the fish hatchery, that probably make it easier for them. But just the fact of the patterns of food gathering and scavenging here is roadkill and things like that. So they probably are habituated to look at roads and see that and see other raptors gathering, whether it be turkey vultures and things like that. Eagles out on the coast, I don't know how much they get for food sources from like roadways and things like that, but their ability probably to see and find food source probably is going to be a big factor there.
Right, and whether or not they could be reproductively and trained to a new cycle is for somebody beyond my grade.
They're going to say, what is that glass layer, that ice layer on the water? And I wonder if they would try to get into fish. It's like, it looks like a water body, but I can't get past this barrier here. That would be a totally new thing for them. That'd be interesting to see.
And what about migration with eagles? We talked about some of the physical and behavioral adaptations that they have to the cold earlier, but we didn't really touch on that. Not all eagles are residents in specific areas. Some of them will migrate as well. And do you see that like along the Mississippi River corridor?
Oh, absolutely. You should just talk about the flyway cam.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we put the Mississippi River flyway cam up was watching the waterfowl, the tundra swans and pelicans and eagles, just the migratory pathway there to see that from the bluff when we're monitoring the falcons. So actually having a camera out in the flyway, out on Lake Onalaska by close to La Crosse, Wisconsin, we get to see that migration. But you're right, we've got resident eagles, and then we've got and those are the ones that probably are nesting, and they're staying year-round because they're nesting and creating young. And then there's the others that don't. And we've got monitors and satellite radio transmitters on the eagles. And we know in the summer time period that they're going all the way up to Hudson Bay area. We just had our D27 eagle. She has gone up to mid-Canada, just about in that same
Western
latitude.
Ontario, but the same latitude.
So in the summer months, they're going up north because of the hotter weather for them. And then in the wintering time period, they're going south down into probably like the Missouri, Ohio area. And some of them are coming from Canada, are coming down just to this area and wintering not too far away from here, I think. Yeah,
so they tend to be, and they're somewhat variable. So we've seen two of them, D1 and D27, that have made these huge, giant migrations anyway, maybe not looping migrations. But we also have one D24 that we believe has stuck closer to home the entire time. You'll see, like John had mentioned, sometimes eagles will fly around until they're about 4.5 years old and settle down. Sometimes they spend a lot longer as floaters, which would be reproductively able but non-active adults. So they're really quite variable in their behavior, and it's one of the things that makes them interesting. Besides just that they're totally cool.
And parts of North America that I've lived in, like Alaska, eagles will have a bit of a short migration. So they won't necessarily leave the entire area. They won't be going from northern Ontario, for instance, down to the Mississippi River. But what they'll be doing is they'll be leaving the middle of Katmai National Park, flying to the edge of the Bering Sea or flying to the edge of the Pacific where they can find open water. So we touched on all of these adaptations that they have to cold weather. I mean, they can handle it. They can handle sub-zero weather. Really, no problem. It's really the fact that they need to find food. I mean, that seems to be one of the main bottlenecks. So if you can find food, you can make a living if you're an eagle.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, and we're about 30 minutes in, and I think that's as much time as we can devote to eagles today. Although I think we could probably talk about the animals for hours on end. But I would like to. I would like to thank John and Amy from the Raptor Resource Project for joining me this afternoon. Great organization. Check out their website, raptorresource.org. You can find the links to all of their webcams directly on their website. You can also go to explore.org and find many of the webcams directly on there. It's an exciting time of the year to be watching all of these webcams because we're seeing the birds beginning to nest. Some of the eagles on the cams have already hatched some young, like in Channel Islands National Park. So really a great time of the year to be tuning in. And there's a lot more excitement to come with ospreys and peregrine falcons, owls, a whole bunch of other things are going to be nesting quite soon. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and we will talk to you soon on explore.org.
Thanks,
Mike.